Aishu, your host for the day. On behalf of Karwaan, the Heritage Exploration Initiative, I am honored to welcome our speaker, Ambassador Shivshankar Menon, for the session on the past and present of India's foreign policy. Ambassador Menon is an Indian diplomat who served as the National Security Advisor under Prime Minister Manmohan Singh. He has previously served as the Foreign Secretary in Ministry of External Affairs. Prior to that, he was Indian High Commissioner to Pakistan, Sri Lanka, and Ambassador to China and Israel. He is currently a visiting professor of international relations at Ashoka University. His areas of interest include international politics, national security issues, India-China relations, Chinese politics and development, Indian Ocean, and cyber security, among others. This session will be moderated by Eshan Sharma, who is the founder of Karwaan. Eshan likes to call himself a historian in training. He is a heritage activist, TEDx speaker, writer, and is currently pursuing his master's in modern Indian history from History Department of the Maharaja Sayajirao University. He did his graduation from University of Delhi. He is the founder of India's leading history student collective called Karwaan. He is vocal within the space of making history and heritage accessible, inclusive, and engaging. Now I'd like to call the moderator for the session, that is Eshan, and Ambassador Shivshankar Menon on the stage.
Are we audible?
Yes.
Good evening, everybody. Welcome to Karwaan Batter. It is a modern take on the ancient idea of Kotuhalashalas, where people used to come and debate, discuss, and defend their arguments rather on various things and policies. I am a film historian under training. I like to call myself under training because you never be a historian in life. It's a thing that is very continuous. But I've taken the charge to talk about international relations. So my questions are going to be very basic, but we'll try to explore a lot of areas of interest for both of us. The Batak is about a book that Ambassador Menon published a few years ago, India and Asian Geopolitics. And we'll be talking about India and the Asian geopolitics in the session. So if you have phones with you, I would request all of you to turn them off. Or if you have a good camera, please feel free to click pictures. Because it's a student collective, we always fail to ask for a photographer. So you can be our photographer. So Ambassador Menon, to start the conversation, you have chosen the word geopolitics. It's a slippery slope when you use such a larger, such a word with a larger meaning. So why did you choose geopolitics as the title of the book?
Well, it's true. I actually say it's a very slippery term in the introduction. But the reason I chose it was because it's become increasingly common. People use it, and it's no longer what the classical geopoliticians thought of, the influence of geography on a state's policies. Or because geopolitics, when it started with Mackinder, Mahan, and so on, was a pretty imperial construct, right? It was about how do we maintain the British Empire to start with, and how do we dominate the world. But today when people say geopolitics, what they mean is the broader influences on state policy. So economics, demography, history, geography certainly as the basis. And for me, geography is very important. It is a big determinant of how you act and what states do. And the reason I chose geopolitics, therefore, was because I wanted to broaden the lens. Normally when people try and explain Indian foreign policy and so on, it's all about leaders or personalities, which I think is frankly trivializing foreign policy. Or it's about superpowers, great powers, and reacting to them. And it's all about the US, Soviet Union during the Cold War. It's about, whereas for me, the joy in Indian foreign policy has been, I think, the fact Asia is our home, and how we interacted with Asia and with things changing in Asia. And it's not enough to take, say, just the Cold War, bipolar, to explain Indian foreign policy all the way from 47 until the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. No, The Cold War itself changed in Asia, became very complicated. 71, suddenly China switched sides, became an ally of the US against the Soviet Union. You had to deal with a very different situation, China, Pakistan. So you can't just say, oh, bipolar world, therefore India. But that's the tempting thing, because the material, everything out there, most Western scholarship is all about from their point of view and how it looked. So one reason why I wrote this was to broaden the lens and use geopolitics rather than just politics, because geography to my mind matters, but also Asian geopolitics rather than. That's really why the title. And the past present, because the past affects the present. I think it's still there, a lot of what happened before. But you'll notice on the cover, it's not a map, it's a compass. So I have no idea where we're going. But at least the past should provide you with directions, right? You should have a general sense of where you want to go, of the direction of progress rather than. And so that's why it looks the way it is and why I chose that title. The publisher said this is an impossible title, nobody will ever buy the book. But I said, no, it's an honest title, it's the truth. And if people are serious enough to buy it despite the title, then you know that you have somebody who's going to read it. So that wasn't enough for the publisher, but ultimately they gave it.
So you have removed personalities, you have removed powers.
I haven't removed personalities because you can't keep them out.
Yeah.
But they are not the sole determinant. When you say India's foreign policy, people love to say, oh, this is Nehru's policy and this is Indira Gandhi's policy. But there are continuities, or this is Modi's policy. But there are continuities in Indian policy. This quest for strategic autonomy, for instance. You can call it non-alignment, you can call it strategic autonomy. Janata Party used to call it genuine non-alignment. Yeah. Whatever you want. But you're doing the same thing, right? You're keeping your freedom of decision-making, that power, that freedom to judge whether something's in your interest, whether it's good or bad, that's your decision. And that's what every government of India has done. And that, I think, is not because of the personality of these leaders. It's because of the situation we're in, and because of the compulsions of what we are. So that's why geopolitics.
Yeah. No, but by your answer, I on a lighter note, you really want a Renaissance audience to read your work. who has an interest in geography and then who has an interest in IA. Very hard to find among my generation.
It's not an academic book. It's
Yeah.
it's a practitioner's book.
Yeah.
And it came out of a course that I teach in Ashoka University. And the reason, and it's large part of it is the past. The first part of the book it's more historical. Because, I remember I stood up in class one day and I said something about Mrs. Gandhi, thinking of Indira Gandhi, and they all thought I meant Sonia Gandhi. Suddenly I realized, whoops, this whole generation, everybody in my class was born in this century. I was born in the first half of the last century, barely, 1949, but, and it's suddenly, my life was history, for these people. So, and they were interested in it, which surprised me. I didn't expect that. So I thought, write it. And so it's a sort of, it's not an IR book, it's not a history book, it's not, none of these things. It's just a practitioner's view of how things work.
There's a reason why we are called the Gen Z. We don't really understand half of our previous generations, but you have made a very important statement that past defines the present. And the situation today, as we speak, the context is that the NCERT is hellbound in changing the curriculum and really spoke the mind of a lot of us. But take us through.
I switched chairs because this keeps sinking under me. Yeah, he was saying NCERT.
Yeah, the NCERT has decided to remove some of the important themes of history. But I'll come to that later when we'll speak of the moral ethics of a government institution like NCERT. But let's go through the chronology of Indian foreign policy. Chronology samajhna, I think, is very important. So why don't you talk about the Nehruvian approach? And because now there's discussion on non-alignment movement 2.0, where they are saying India should lead the movement, and there's something called positive unilateralism that should emerge. So, I've learned that term just before the event. Please clap for me. so how do you see that?
Well, for me, and I spent some time in the book describing the situation at independence. And if you think of it, Nehru came as Vice Chairman, then as Prime Minister in September 46 when he took over the interim government. He had spent 2 years as Chairman of the Hyderabad Municipal Council. He had no other experience of running anything. But he had thought deeply about it. And if you look at the leaders at that time, they were people who had an idea of what they wanted to achieve with India. And for them, their biggest job was transform India. There were too many poor, hungry, illiterate. I mean, this for them was unacceptable. That a society which had been one of the most advanced, one of the most productive, in every sense, intellectually, every which way, that this was now reduced to this by colonialism. And so for them, the transformation of India, but they knew they couldn't do this alone. That you needed the rest of the world, and you needed a peaceful environment, which is why they were so worried about the atom bomb, nuclear disarmament, and so on. But also they thought that you needed a supporting environment to enable their transformation. And that's why they worked for decolonization, because it was part of creating a world in which you could be safe and in which your people could prosper. And now that impulse is very different from, and there were people even at that time, many people, Rajaji for instance, Panikkar originally, K.M. Panikkar, who said, no, our job is to be a great power. A lot of this is influenced by British thinking. But now think of it. If you want to be a great power, then you do certain things. You need military strength, you need to be able to get other people to do what you want. So you need to be able to compel other people to do what you want, or at least incentivize them. You then build one kind of state, right? So there's no line between internal and external. But if you want to transform your country, then the rest of the world becomes a means to this, rather than, it's a very different goal. Is your goal India's transformation? Is it India's rise? That you have to choose. And the choice has been India's transformation right through. Now suddenly, now that we have accumulated a certain amount of power, now we're not sure. So there are some of us who think, no, we should be a great power. People write books saying, why is India not a great power yet, etc. There's a lot of... There are others who think, no, we still have a long way to go. Why do we have so much stunting among our children? Why do we have people who still go to bed hungry? So for me, that dynamic actually drives foreign policy and is really the primary motivator of what kind of India you want to build. Now, it's not that we've always agreed on everything. There's this mythological view, this romantic view of the past, that we used to have consensus on foreign policy, but now nobody agrees and we're all fighting among us. We've always fought on foreign policy. That's normal. In fact, it's good. And it helps us to clarify our own thinking.
Yeah.
Even at independence, there were people who said we should be allied with the British and form this huge defensive structure. It's really a sub-imperial structure from Suez to Australia, all the way to Japan, where we would be the center of this defensive arrangement. And many people who were powerful actually in the Congress Party argued for this. Of course, the communists argued that you must ally with the Soviet Union. There were those Swatantra Party, who said, no, you must ally with the US and democracies, the free world. And you were think of your condition. You didn't have one Indian Standard Time. You were fighting a communist insurgency revolution in Telangana with Rana Day. You were trying to amalgamate these 560 plus princely states. You were dealing with 10 million refugees out of partition. You're fighting a war in Kashmir, up in the mountains. just think of your condition. And so where do you draw the line? You can't say, to hell with the world, I'll come to the world when I'm ready, I'll first fix my problems. Because the world is in your face all the time. So I think we tend to forget how interwoven all this is. And it's still true, even today. When we look at our economy, for instance, when we look at our needs from the rest of the world, and we are a country who don't have non-ferrous metals. We need them from the rest of the world. We don't have the energy we need for our economy. How do you get them? You get them from the rest of the world. How do you pay for them? You better export if you want to import. And the logic is simple, that there are things, because you're backward, you need technology. You need things, you need the world. So what do? You work with as many people as you can. You build an online movement of other people who share your interests in the rest of the world. So for me, that history is actually the fascinating part of how your internal, external needs meet each other and how you then cope. And the world keeps changing around you, especially the world in Asia. In 54, Pakistan joins the US treaty system. 55, Seattle and CENTO. 54, she signs a mutual defense agreement. Suddenly the Cold War is on your doorstep. How do you deal with it? Do you then go and join the Soviets? In 71, that's the choice you made. You tilted the other way, you balanced. But in 54, you said, no, I will work with everybody else to isolate you and create an area of peace in Asia. That was what Bandung, the whole non-aligned movement, and you had certain successes at that period. You played both balancing, but also enlarging the area of peace. But you said, I'm not going to play your game of bringing the superpowers in, because they'll come in and do what they want. They're not going to do what we want here. So, for me, that's the fascinating part of the geopolitics, of how this interplay goes on and how different people reacted and dealt with it.
You mentioned a word called war, and it happens everywhere, every time, and if it is not happening to your part of the country or your part of the continent, it doesn't mean it doesn't happen. It is there. The government very cleverly has abstained from calling it a war. They call the Russian conflict between Russia and Ukraine. So as a career diplomat and a professor now, so almost a historian, one should say, so as a historian and a career diplomat, how do you see the importance of studying war and also contextualizing wars? Because context is missing from the textbooks.
Most of them. In fact, it's very important. But as you know, the IR scholars used to say, war made the state and the state makes war.
Yeah.
And both are true. Many of these fantastic fiscal inventions are all done, income tax. Many of these things were invented in order to finance wars. And it's true, many financial instruments, and vice versa. And states make war, and ever since you've had the Westphalian idea of absolute sovereignty, great power rivalry, and therefore wars, have been a standard for Europe. Fought 400 years of war. First in Europe, then they exported it to the rest of us. I mean, the killing fields of the Cold War were in Asia, but otherwise violence was against huge populations. I mean, you think of what happened in America to the indigenous population and so on. So the state did make war until Europe finally exhausted itself and actually knocked itself out to the point where its two wings, where it expanded through the 19th century, Russia and America, those two wings then actually dominated Europe, drew a line down the middle, and France and Germany made peace, and suddenly they become angels after 400 years of fighting wars. It's not as though their nature changed, but it's the result of this phenomenon. So you have to understand war and its context, and there's no getting away from it. Luckily, that also keeps diplomats in their jobs. It means that you have guaranteed lifetime employment. And it means that you can feel good about what you're doing, because what you're trying to do is to bring peace. and trying to avoid the worst effects of war. Now, in the Ukrainian case, for instance, if you look at the context, it's from a diplomat's point of view, or even geopolitics, let's say. If NATO comes into Ukraine, you have NATO soldiers, missiles within 300 miles of Moscow. Now, how would that be acceptable to the Russians? Vice versa, if the Russians are in Ukraine, you have Russian troops and missiles within less than 300 miles of Berlin, less than 100 miles of Vienna, Warsaw, Prague, or all these European capitals. How would it be acceptable to them? The solution to a diplomat is obvious, is you already had a belt of neutral states, Austria, Sweden, Finland, right? So neutralize Ukraine. Create a belt where neither side can threaten each other. That would have been the logical solution. But of course, neither side chose that. Both sides seem to think that war and trouble seem to work for them. And it's actually a war that's been going on now for several years. It didn't break out on the 24th of February last year, when you saw the invasion of Crimea. So I think you need to look at that broader geopolitical, the geography of that war, in order to understand where it's coming from, and why neither military means is going to solve this problem, nor sanctions and so on is going to solve the problem. And the only solution, as far as I can see, is them sitting around the table and adjusting their interests, each one accommodating the other's interests in one way or the other. Today, to say we neutralize the belt is finished because both Sweden and Finland are joining NATO, and so they now have doubled the front between NATO and Russia. So it seems to be for a long time to come, you're going to have a Europe that's preoccupied with its own internal security order and preoccupied with itself, and less effective as a global actor as a result. But this is not a happy situation. I mean, we're all paying an economic price for this in terms of inflation, high energy costs, food prices have gone up across the world. And we're paying an economic price for political gains. So politics is in command today of what should be economic decisions, or used to be economic decisions in the globalization year. So and you look at the other side effects of what's happened. Ukraine used to have nuclear weapons because the old Soviet weapons were placed in. They signed a memorandum, the Budapest Memorandum in 1994, with the US, UK, and Russia, giving up their nuclear weapons. In return, all three guaranteed their sovereignty and territorial integrity. They got invaded twice after that, lost Crimea. You saw what happened. Who's going to trust anybody? Who is going to give up nuclear weapons when they have it? You think Kim Jong-un is going to give up nuclear weapons now? After he's seen what happened here, what happened to Gaddafi, who gave up his nuclear weapons, what happened to Saddam Hussein, who acts as if he has nuclear weapons when he doesn't have them. So you've just destroyed the non-proliferation regime as it was, at least. I mean, remove the incentives for good behavior on a whole host of states. And so actually, when you look at, so when you say, war is central, yes, but look at the consequences, in which directions you have to look for second-order effects, economics, it's across the board. And so war must be studied. And there's no point turning your back on it and just saying, no, I don't like it, so I'll ignore it, I'll put my head in the sand and, it'll go away. It won't go away. War will not leave you alone, no matter what you do, and it is central. So yes, unfortunately, the book also has many wars.
Yeah. No, but first...
But successful policy is that which actually avoids wars. And to that extent, Indian policy has become much more successful. We fought 4 wars in the first 25 years of the Republic. We've had conflict. We've had sort of sub-conventional wars, terrorism, etc., asymmetric warfare going on. But we haven't had the kind of, you can say this is because we have nuclear weapons now and therefore it's sort of put a cap on the kind of conventional wars you can fight, or you can say we've got better at diplomacy and understanding what we're doing, or you can say that we now have means on both sides that we're actually learning, maybe, whatever. I mean, if you're an optimist, you say because we're such good people, but there I'd be a little skeptical.
you have again reminded me of one of my favorite quotes of recent times. I'll read that out. Europe has to grow out of the mindset that Europe's problems are the world's problem, but the world's problem are not Europe's problem.
Well, Europe's problems were the world's problems.
Yeah.
I mean, as long as Europe had the power.
Yeah.
World War I was a European war, and Indians fought in it. World War II was a European war, but it was also an Asian war, thanks to Japan, which had become a European power by then, in many respects. And so, you can understand why they behave the way they are, and they certainly haven't come to terms with the idea that they are no longer central. But the end of the Cold War, the main fault line, geopolitical fault line in the world during the Cold War, was in Europe. Which is why Europe was peaceful, actually. I mean, the whole thing was a confrontation through Fulda Gap. Germany was partitioned, there was a Soviet sphere and an American sphere. And they fought around the fringes. In Korea, actually Asia was the Cold War killing field. But today, the fact is, and with the end of the collapse of the Soviet Union, end of the Cold War, Europe is peripheral to world geopolitics. Still an economic power. But Europe is not the central geopolitical. The central issue is here, between China and the US. And the US trying to prevent a rising China from emerging as a real peer competitor for her. And for that, Europe is a long way away. So yes, I mean, when Mr. Shivshankar says that, he has a point that Europe's problems are not our problems necessarily. The trouble is, this, as I said, the second order effects. You can't avoid them. You are in a globalized world today, whether you like it or not. So, I mean, how much you pay for oil depends on what happens in Ukraine, how much, energy imports, what you're doing. All this actually bothers you. You import inflation because of that war. So there is actually, Europe might not be determining what happens in Asia, but what happens in Europe does affect us. So, and there's a distinction there and that's part of the problem. But at the same time, you have to understand that our ability, or even China's ability to affect the outcome in Ukraine is very limited. It's so you are in this strange world between orders, where you're all affected, but your capacity to produce outcomes is very limited, is relatively low. Because you're between orders. You're not in an orderly world at all. You're in a world adrift, actually, between orders.
Yeah. Because I visited Murti Bhavan yesterday, which was Nehru's residence, while I was looking through the rooms, I thought I might find Nehru sitting there because he's much more talked about than the present Prime Minister. So, one of the allegations that is made to Nehru by the opposition, which is opposition to Congress, is that he made a blunder with the Chinese. And you are a specialist on India-China relations. So I'll start the conversation with, how do you see that quote-unquote blunder of Nehru with the Chinese that resulted to a war, maybe?
Well, I think, yes, he made a mistake. In fact, he made mistakes in his dealings with China. But I don't think, and this is why I say, foreign policy is not Nehru's policy. Yeah. It's actually, everybody finds it convenient to say it was Nehru, because then, it's not the Foreign Office's fault. Where were we? What was the army telling him? What was the intelligence people telling him? But nobody paid the price for what happened in '62. It's much easier to dump it on Nehru or on Krishna Menon, or choose a figure, whoever you want. Yeah. The risk with that, okay, so you get away with it. The risk is you don't learn the right lessons. You don't actually go out and say, okay, these are the things that went wrong, this is where the system failed us, what we should have done, and therefore now let's make sure that this never happens again. You still ended up in an inconclusive war with Pakistan in '65. despite the huge effort that under General Chaudhry we made in military reform, and the Pakistani conviction that they had to actually act before India's military reforms actually took hold and actually gave us too much of a lead over Pakistan in 65. And they underestimated Shastri also, because they personalized things and it led them into. But the fact is that it took longer for you to do the necessary changes, which you did after 65. And you saw the results in 71, in terms of effectiveness, in terms of military effectiveness, and in terms of coordination across the government when you dealt with the 1971 crisis. Right through that year, with the refugees, with what was started as the East Pakistan crisis. And so, yes, I think Nehru made mistakes. I think but I also blame the system or everybody else who was in the system at that time. And I think it's very easy to say, oh, it's number one's job. You know, he's supposed to do, but then what the hell is everybody else there for? Where was everybody else? And the intelligence was telling you that the Chinese are not going to do anything. But there were people within the system who actually saw what was coming, who warned about it. And why weren't they listened to? Why weren't some precautions taken? I mean, that's the problem. And even now, we don't release the Henderson-Brooks report, the Bhagat Henderson-Brooks report, which to my mind is really, it shows an unwillingness to face bad realities, harsh realities. Because unless you learn from these things, you are storing up more trouble for the future. So that's, I mean, when people say, oh, you can't learn lessons from history, you can learn lessons from history. It doesn't mean that history is going to repeat itself or you have to do exactly the same things. But you can certainly understand what you shouldn't be doing in cases like this, what you should be looking out for.
So one thing that has not changed in terms of foreign policies is that we have not yet made that will to accept realities. And
why?
Because recently, in the media, even Dr. Shivshankar said that Rahul Gandhi called China, the relations with China harmony, but for us, for India, it's discord. And we are more than ready to go into.
I don't know who called what, but if you look at our relationship with China today, it has both extremes. They're our biggest trading partner. I just saw there's an IFT, Institute of Foreign Trade report, saying they are essential to our exports. But at the same time, we have almost 100,000 troops lined up on the LAC in the western sector. Political relations are in deep freeze. The status quo hasn't been restored on the LAC after what the Chinese did in 2020. So the political relationship really is in bad shape. Yeah, trade is going on, it's booming at the same time. So you can say what you like about this relationship. You can say it's terrible if you look at the politics and the boundary and what's happening. You can say, no, but look, it's going on, normal life is going on. Chinese are quite happy. They've changed the status quo in their favor. They are saying, no, put the boundary in its place and let's move on. You know, there's no... But they also signal very little willingness to actually compromise or make adjustments. I mean, because they now frame it in sovereignty terms as an issue of territorial integrity and sovereignty. They used to describe the boundary as disputed and a question left over from history. Now that has certain advantages. One, it's not our fault. It's blame the British, blame somebody else. Two, it's a dispute, which means you can settle it by negotiating, by give and take. Right? So there's a willingness to compromise that's implicit in that description of the problem. The moment you define it as an issue of territorial sovereignty, integrity, it becomes non-negotiable. Who can negotiate territorial integrity? Who can negotiate sovereignty? Sovereignty is absolute, right? So you've got into this situation today where it seems to me much harder to actually move forward. And the old modus vivendi, which kept the peace for 30 years plus, that no longer applies. You don't have agreed rules for how you handle the border and your political relationship. And you could say, yeah, okay, during COVID, during all this, it was a abnormal time. Now we're back to relatively normal times, or at least to the new normal. And I think it's time that you need to actually address this. So both those statements are probably true. It's both at the same time. And this is really I think the biggest challenge today for our foreign policy is really dealing with China and how we cope with this. How we find a way forward out of this kind of impasse that we've got ourselves into.
On this, I would like to ask a very small question. Do you think the policy these days under the regime is more assertive than the previous, or because it's defensive, it's more aggressive?
Well, let me say the expression of the policy, I think, is partly because it's playing to a domestic political base.
Yeah.
Is much more nationalistic, much more in your face than it was before. But you know, this is democratic politics. Every government says, we are new, we are better, everybody else before us, they were all fools, they had no idea what we're doing, and now we have fixed everything, we're the best. But for me, more important than how you say it and how you present yourself and how you control the narrative, much more important, for me, foreign policy is not about narrative. Narrative is a tool, but it's a tool to create outcomes. Your job is to create outcomes that work for you, that serve your interests. And if you look at what people have actually done for outcomes, then frankly, I don't see that much difference between various Indian governments, which is easy for a diplomat like me because you feel your job is to serve India, right? You're not serving individual parties or governments or individuals. And you can serve India because this is India's interest. And frankly, across the board, you look at the big things, there are shifts in emphasis because the world has changed, the situation around you has changed. But whether it is the relationship with Bangladesh, which has been transformed, it's taken 15 years and 3 governments to do it. You look at the relationship with the US, it's taken something like 6 or 8 governments on both sides to do what we've now got, right? You look at the relationship with Israel, or what's happening across the Gulf. Again, these are things, there are fundamental continuities. You've shifted because the nature of the situation has changed. It's no longer the same situation as it was 10 years ago. So some of these things you'll shift the emphasis, you'll do more of something, more. But I don't see some big fundamental break. But I expect people to say we are different, we're better, nobody else knows as much as we do. And this I treat as part of domestic, politics.
Yeah, you have made an important point that narratives are now, because there's an election every year now. Virtually, you are fighting an election every year. The Prime Minister is seen more on the TV than the Parliament. But do you think? And you mentioned that now domestic issues are being taken as international issues, maybe to showcase how the winds have turned, or whatever you want to call it. So how challenging this is going to be for India, which is rising in the global south, and do you think it's going to backfire in coming years for India?
Just to put it in context, I think the external context has become much harder for India, right, in the last few years. So it's natural that you turn inwards. And we're not the only ones doing this. We might talk about Atmanirbharta and so on, and you therefore rely much more on nationalistic appeal at home, consolidate your own base, and present what you do abroad domestically and use it for domestic politics. We're not the only ones doing this. It's happening in America, it's happening in China, where they speak of self-reliance, dual circulation, etc. You can see this across the world. It's not, as the outside situation gets harder, you concentrate more on the internal. So this, I think, is a normal adjustment. It's not unique to us. The problem with these things is, and I think we are not yet there, but the Chinese certainly face this problem. Once you reveal ambition, it's very hard to take it back. Once you say, I want to be number one, then the rest of the world says, yeah, but what about us? Right? And they will act on that assumption that you are now, your interests are different from theirs, and they will see how they can take care of their own interests, separate from yours. And that's exactly what's happening to China. You see the pushback across maritime Asia. Everybody is trying different ways to cope with it. And there's very few who can match China's power. Only the US can. But each one is trying in his own way to deal with that. And now Xi Jinping can make nice and say China should be, I think he used the word lovable last year when he was talking to his own diplomats. And he can, make gestures here, there. But nobody's going to forget what they were saying for the last 5 years about China taking center stage, China being number one in the world, that we will restore the wrongs of the century of humiliation, all these things. So there is a risk here when you adopt a sort of ultra-nationalist rhetoric. Manjari Chatterjee Miller wrote an interesting book on the rise of great powers, where she says there's three things that all successful great powers do. One is they follow, of course they accumulate power, hard material power, economic, military, etc. That take for granted. They follow an accommodationist strategy with the existing order. They work with the existing order. So, in other words, they do what Deng Xiaoping did, hide and bite. You accumulate economic strength, military strength, etc., but you don't go up against the hegemon while you're accumulating power and while you're too weak. Secondly, you have a narrative which leads the rest of the world to allow your rise. Either you present it as being non-offensive, or you present it as being in everyone's interest. So again, what Deng did as peaceful rise, the China's peaceful rise, we are just improving the livelihood of our own people. We need to do this as our people's welfare. And the world assisted China's rise, and also offered it as good for everyone else, saying you can all make money out of China's rise, and they did. So, but the third element is timing. When do you decide to actually reveal your desire to be a great power?
Yeah.
Those who do it too early, militarist Japan in the 30s, Wilhelmine Germany, World War I, they fail because there will be a countervailing coalition which will bring power to bear, even though you might think you have the power. Whereas those who slide their way through, the US is one example, even Britain, which started off as a weaker power vis-a-vis Spain, they manage successfully to go through. Now, you might not agree with the details of her analysis. It's worth reading, by the way. It's fun to think about it. But I think there's some truth there, that timing and the narrative is very important, that how you present it, and other people should see an interest in your rise, right? We are in a relative sweet spot. At least the rest of maritime Asia, the US seem to think that our rise, given their rivalry with China, they see our rise as being in their interest. Use the moment. It may not last, you don't know how long this will last. But while you have the moment, use it. So to an extent, we are in a geopolitical sort of sweet spot at the moment.
So you think that we should be revealing our cards now?
No, I didn't say that at all. I said, in fact, the opposite. Now is the time to build your strength. Use the world's interest in your rise to take care. You have too many people who are sick or poor. You have too much stunting among your children. You have enough problems at home to deal with. Now is the time to fix all this. This is the thing, to use this external situation